Good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock here on the East Coast, and we are going to start our presentation. We're so thankful to have you all here with us. Tonight's Global Conversation in Literacy Research will be with Dr. Norton. It's so nice to see so many of you returning to our GCLR web seminars, and a welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We're so glad to have you here with us. Tonight's presentation on identity, investment, and multilingual literacy will address the important role of identity in language and literacy. Please feel free to interact throughout the presentation to Dr. Norton's ideas by typing in the chat area. We're especially excited tonight to be able to announce to you that Dr. Norton's foundational work, Identity and Language Learning, published in 2000, has now been revised, and a new second edition will be available very soon. Also, it will be available as a digital ebook, and we're very excited to announce that tonight and share this news with you. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Dr. Dennis Odo, both professors of language and literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, and me, Amy Pellicero, a language and literacy doctoral candidate at Georgia State University. We also have David Brown, Tuba Ange Crowder, and Christy Pace joining us. They're doctoral students at Georgia State and part of the GCLR research team. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consist of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the fields of literacy and language arts. GCLR currently seeks volunteers for a study on the nature of technology, mediated interactions with literacy-focused web seminars. If you're willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address in the chat area, and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. The collected data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarships across the world. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box. Dr. Oda will monitor the area, and Dr. Norton will address these as time permits at the end of the presentation. We also want to remind you that because Dr. Norton is transmitting from Canada, you may experience a brief lag in transmission from time to time. We would really love to know where you are participating from tonight. So please use the red wand located to the immediate left of this slide and click your location for us on the map. If you're having trouble locating the wand, a picture of it is located here at the bottom of the slide. It's great to see so many of you coming from all over, and thank you for showing us and for coming tonight. Dr. Bonny Norton is a professor and distinguished university scholar at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Her research interests include, but are not limited to, identity, imagined communities and language learning, literacy and international development, and critical literacy and popular culture. Recognition of Dr. Norton's impressive research began with her groundbreaking dissertation work on identity, investment, and language learning that was later published in 2000 as a book-length monograph entitled Identity and Language Learning, Gender, Ethnicity, and Educational Change. Again, it's our pleasure tonight to announce that Dr. Norton has revised this foundational text, and the second edition will be released very soon and will also be available in digital form as an ebook. Dr. Norton's numerous publications shape a new paradigm of how identity is understood in language learning by way of imagined identities, imagined communities, and critical language pedagogies. On a personal note, I can say that Dr. Norton's prolific and profound work has greatly influenced my thinking and direction in the doctoral program and informs my own dissertation research with refugee women. At this time, and on behalf of the GCLR team, it is truly my privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Bonny Norton. Please join me in welcoming her with a virtual round of applause.
Okay, Bonnie, you're on.
Okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Amy. And it's an amazing privilege to be here with you today. I want to check that people can hear me before I proceed. Can people just, lots of smiley faces, so I'm assuming that all is well. And that's great, thank you. So perhaps before I even begin, I would like to say thank you so much to Peggy Albers, who has been absolutely remarkable in pulling together a fantastic team of emerging scholars to make a huge difference in democratizing education and knowledge flows in the international community. And on a personal level, we're so happy at UBC that Dennis Murphy-Odo, who trained by the wonderful Lee Gunderson, has moved from UBC to Georgia State, and that we can stay connected to Dennis through these multiple technology networks. So it's a pleasure to see you and to work with you again, Dennis. A few preliminary comments, and perhaps I'll just take you through to my first slide over here. I just want to say that as we do in Canada, is to recognize that the University of British Columbia is located on the land, the ancestral land of the Musqueam people, unceded territory, and to acknowledge the significance of this. Although we live in a digital world, land is still very important to, of course, millions of people all over the world, and we need to acknowledge that land itself is a resource, a very important resource in the international community. Now, this is a new technology for me. It's very exciting to work with the new technology, and in a sense, I'm sure for many of you, technology is a need-to-know approach to learning, and now I've needed to know how to work Blackboard Collaborate and Illuminate. And so for me, the exciting possibility is to see how I can use this technology in ways that are distinct from print. So although I do have many articles that are available for people to access, and certainly you can check out my website for many publications, my hope in using this technology is to provide a complement to a lot of research that is actually available in print. So I'm going to be using a lot of images in this presentation, because what I want to do is to bring you into a different world, not only into the world of ideas, but also into a very real world in the African context where I have been working for many years. And in fact, I also want to note that I wish to dedicate this particular session to mothers in different parts of the world. Biological mothers, adopted mothers, foster mothers, stepmothers. Because in my research in many parts of the world, I have seen that mothers have played a huge role in the education of young people. And I want to acknowledge the many mothers in our own lives. The topic of my talk today is identity, investment, and multilingual literacy. So just beginning with the whole notion of identity, what I'm going to do in this talk is to introduce a few central ideas, and then I'm going to move on to the research. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing the ideas, although I will touch on certainly the main ideas I would like to share with you. And so I have always been intrigued by the relationship between the individual and the social world. And I've asked myself, how do we theorize the complex relationship between the language learner and the social world? And I am very interested in the relationship between theory and practice. I have noticed also in my research that women and women scholars have been very active in application of research and application of theory, but there's also a large role for us to play in the development of theory. And my attempts, in fact, of the last 10, 15 years, 20 years have been to help to develop theory in the field. And so I've been working on ideas around identity, investment, and imagined identities and imagined communities. So for me, the question is, under what conditions does social interaction take place? When we think of social interaction, then we're not only thinking of speaking and listening, but also reading and writing. And in relation to that, I ask, to what extent do social relations of power, such as racism, sexism, elitism, or homophobia, limit the opportunities for learners to speak, to read, or write? Because I'm centrally concerned with social justice and the promotion of equity in our research and in our classrooms. So what I argue when I talk about identity, I say that every time learners speak, listen, read, or write, they are not only engaged in an exchange of information, they are organizing and reorganizing a sense of who they are and how they relate to the social world. They are, in other words, engaged in identity construction and negotiation. So even at this particular point, I am, although we're in a digital context now, I am speaking to you all as a scholar, as a white woman, as a Canadian, and with a strange and unusual accent, which is South African. So I do have multiple identities, and I speak to you from different identity positions. And for me, what is very important is to understand from what positions do people speak, or under what conditions are people silenced. And this takes us back to the issue of identity. Now, if you look at traditional conceptions of identity, people were often seen in traditional terms to have a unified identity, as good or bad, motivated or unmotivated, anxious or confident, introvert or extrovert. And people were seen to have, in a sense, a personality, and people would talk about, who is the real you? Who is the real you? And I remember, in fact, when I came to Canada, my father said to me, Bonnie, you're going to have to decide whether you're Canadian or whether you're South African, which was a terrifying question for me, because it threw me into complete crisis, because, of course, South Africa is a very important part of my life, but, of course, so is Canada. And in fact, I do also see myself as a global citizen. And it was only really when I was introduced to the remarkable work of scholars such as Christine Whedon and post-structuralist theory that I came to see that identity can be understood in different terms, that we have multiple identities, that we can be sometimes motivated and sometimes unmotivated, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes confident, and sometimes inhibited. And so that notion of having the multiplicity of identity is very liberating, because we understand that our identities are not constrained by one single identity. At the same time, some identities are more powerful than others, or more salient than others in particular contexts. So if we think about issues of motivation, for example, motivation has in the past been often assumed a unitary, coherent, and ahistorical learner. You were either motivated or not motivated. And it seemed to be a psychological construct which people are very interested in measuring. But for me, the notion of motivation, which is a helpful construct, needs to be complemented by the notion of investment, which I have developed. Because the notion of investment assumes a complex identity, changing across time and space, and reproduced in social interaction. In other words, it is a sociological and not a psychological construct. So the important point here educationally is the fact that I have argued we need to rethink the kinds of questions that we ask in our classrooms. So that, for example, we can ask a question, what is a learner's motivation to develop literacy? And that's a fair question, but motivation is then seen to be the character trait of a learner. What is the person's motivation in this context? It refers to the learner's personality, and literacy is often seen to be a system. And the student is seen to be responsible for learning. Teachers might say, well, if a student isn't motivated, there's nothing I can do about it. But if we ask a different kind of question, which is, what is the learner's investment in the literacy practices of the classroom or community? We are asking a very different kind of question, because investment is also constructed. A learner may come to a classroom with certain investments in learning, but also what happens in the classroom will affect the learner's investment in the literacy practices of the classroom. And a learner's investment is often related to a learner identity, and their hopes for the future. And literacy is seen as a social practice. It is something that is constructed in classrooms and communities. What this also means is that both the student and the community is responsible for learning. So that if a teacher asks, what is the student's investment in the literacy practices of this classroom? The teacher then is also responsible for creating the kinds of conditions that would lead to investment on the part of the learner. So that while a teacher might say, there's nothing I can do if the student is unmotivated, it is partly a teacher's responsibility to say, well, if a student is not invested in the literacy practices of the classroom, what can I do to make a difference to the student's experiences in this classroom? And of course, that relates also to the student's relationship to other students in the classroom as well. So I'm going to take you after, now that we've had some initial ideas, I want to take you to Africa and to Uganda in particular, where I have been working with these ideas in a digital context. I find it amazing, Peggy, that what you're doing is uniting the world in a digital way, and yet, of course, in many parts of Africa, people are still attempting to enter into the digital world and are very keen to enter the digital world, but do not have the resources that are available in many other parts of the world. But that doesn't mean that people are not interested in entering into this digital world. So I have worked particularly in Uganda, certainly worked in other parts of Africa as well, but I've worked with students in many different parts of Uganda. I'm going to see if I can experiment with this little clicker here. We've worked in Arua, we've worked in northern Uganda, we've worked in eastern Uganda, we've worked in Masaka area, we've worked in Kampala. And you will see here that I'm going to take this out of here. Let's see, I can take this out here. Right. You'll see here that I am very concerned, and the team I've worked with is very concerned with digital possibilities in rural areas, because there's a huge difference, a huge gap between what happens in urban areas and what happens in rural areas in Africa. So I'm going to begin with just a picture here, because one of the things that parents taught us and teachers have said to us from the very beginning of our work in Uganda is that modernity does not involve borrowing someone else's culture, but rather improving on what one already had. And when I was invited into Uganda, in fact I went to Uganda in 2003 as a keynote speaker for the Pan-African Conference on Reading, organized by Sam Mandema, who now in fact is a PhD student with us here at UBC, and also Kate Perry, who's done remarkable work in Africa and Uganda in particular. I did ask my colleagues what their hopes were for my participation, and they said that they hoped that I would help to develop the research infrastructure in the country. So it has been very much a give and take, a learning process for a team of people, and I can share with you some of these remarkable people. I have Maureen Kendrick here as one of my colleagues here at UBC, Julia Tembe, one of my wonderful PhD students who now has returned as Dr. Tembe to Uganda. Same with Harriet Mutonye, another remarkable PhD student now working at Uganda Martyrs University. Hidayah Hassani, who's worked with us as a collaborator. We have Nelson Musamali, a teacher in Eastern Uganda. And here we have Margaret Early, who has also joined our team. And this is a group of students. I have, of course, many wonderful PhD students. I can just scroll down. Many students who have worked with us, both Canadian students and Uganda students. And we continue with the program, and we still have a number of active students who are working with us, and others who have already graduated and returned to Uganda, and also some who are living in Canada. So here we have Dana Hindisibwe, who's worked with us as a collaborator in the Masaka area, and Harriet Mutonye, just giving you a sense of the flavor, the context in which we have worked. I'm forever grateful to the remarkable Willie Ngaka for sharing this slide with me. It was a photograph that he took in northwestern Uganda. And what you see here is a clay keyboard that was developed, that was built by people in northwestern Uganda, where there is very little electricity, running water, and very little access to technology. And yet, in this context, people are greatly invested in the digital and are using clay not only to build animals and homesteads, but little clay toys for children, but also a clay keyboard, so that learners can practice using the keyboard, so that when electricity does come to their villages and when computers do arrive, people will already have some access to technology, and they will have had the opportunity to experiment with technology before they even touch a real computer. And this brings me then to another idea that I have worked with, and that is of the imagined identities and the imagined communities of learners. Because what you see from this image here is that people are thinking of the future. People are hoping that lives will be different in the future and that their identities will be different as they enter the digital world. So what I have said is that an imagined community assumes an imagined identity, and investment in language and literacy must be understood within this context. So the ideas that we've been working with are identity, investment, imagined communities, and imagined identities. So the questions that I've been asking in this context, in the African context, with the team of people that I've been working with, is how have the technological changes of our time influenced language and literacy learning in poorly resourced global communities? And secondly, how are identities and investments re-inscribed in new digital practices at local level? And obviously, what are the implications for classroom practice? So I'm going to give you some pictures of sharing a little bit of a sense, a flavor of the context in which we have worked. Of course, bicycles are ubiquitous in Uganda, and you very seldom see only one person on a bicycle. You very often see 3, 4, 5 people on a bicycle, and of course people transporting goods and materials and bags of grain on bicycles. Here we see people accessing water, of course a very important resource in all communities, of course. People sharing water, and wells are, of course, very important in rural areas. Here we have remarkable teachers. Of course, this is a school that we work in, one of the many schools that we've been working with in Uganda, and 2 or 3 of the remarkable teachers who have been part of our projects. I wanted to just draw your attention to this image because what you see here are many students who are in uniform in Uganda, and uniform is compulsory, I think, in most schools in Uganda, and which is, of course, another huge resource that is necessary for young people. And if people do not have school uniforms, it's very difficult for them to actually attend school. I want to draw your attention also to this building where you would often find 120 to 200 students in a class, and one teacher. This is not unusual in the African context. I thought I had to share with you one picture of a blackboard, because you can imagine if you have 120 to 200 students in a room and all you have is a blackboard in the front of the room, you can see how challenging it can be for a teacher. Now, some of the research that we have done, you may ask the question, if there are so few digital resources, how can people enter the digital world under these conditions? And what we have found is that with hybrid technology, it's remarkable what has been achieved. Already, you're probably aware that in the African context, digital phones are very popular and ubiquitous. And a lot of research is currently being done with digital phones. But the technology that we've been using have been particularly cameras, as well as a resource called the E-Granary Digital Portable Library. So let's have a look at cameras. Now, we've talked about identity as being multiple. Now, we've worked a great deal with students and young women in particular in our research. And what we find is that when you put a camera in the hands of a young woman, you change her identity. She shifts her identity from being a student to being a photographer. And with the identity photographer, she has power in her community. And because it is clear that a young woman with a camera either has resources of her own or she knows people who have resources. And this in turn gives her power in her community. It means that a young woman can go into a police commissioner's office and can take a picture of a police commissioner. Most people in Uganda and many parts of the world avoid going into police stations and avoid interacting with policemen and policewomen. But in this particular case, with a camera in her hand, a student can go into a police commissioner's office and he will take her seriously. Notice that he is very grave and looking at her very seriously while she takes the picture. And just to bring to your attention here a couple of points in this picture, what you see here is water in a bottle, whereas in most parts of Uganda you would not find bottled water. You see here all the literacy materials of a person in a position of power Oh, heavens. Now I've shifted. Now, wait a second. I have moved. I'm going to have to, I pressed the wrong button. So I'm going to have to, let me see here. Lost, let's see here. I've lost my image. Let's see. Yes, I am at the beginning. Oh, here we go. Okay, right. Now I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to go back. If you'll bear with me. Now you can actually, you can go backwards and forwards. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to take you back to the slides here. This is great because you can learn twice. Right, here we go. Okay, there we go. So here we are back with the young woman in our study, and what we see here is that with the camera, these young women can look at themselves in many ways through new eyes. This is a very common image in the Ugandan context, and just to show you here, here we have a water bottle, which is ubiquitous in Uganda, as opposed to the bottled water that the police commissioner had. At the same time, one can see images of a young woman as a nurse in a hospital. And again, what we see is a different image of a young woman, but also someone who is very active in literacy practices of her community. I love this image because in a different study that we did with Dana Hindasibwe and Shelley Jones, when we were introducing a group of young women to the internet and to the computer, many of them had walked by an internet cafe in Masaka and had never entered into the internet cafe. And when they had learned the computer, how to use the computer, they went into the internet cafe and said everybody had to leave because that was their day in the internet cafe. So just a remarkable experience for these young women. Now, the E-Granary Digital Portable Library is another hybrid technology that is very powerful in the African, or has great potential in the African context. It was developed by a group of people at the University of Iowa. It's called the E-Granary Digital Library. And Cliff Milton has been very active in this project. What they did was a very simple idea, actually, with a great, with powerful implications. They took a hard drive and downloaded all kinds of information from Wikipedia, Africa Journals Online, the World Health Organization, and developed a searching software so that people could search at the hard drive if they were connected to a computer. So in fact, what we have is an internet in a box that can be searched like the internet. It has 10 million pieces of information, and the system is continually being upgraded and improved. You can just Google E-Granary and you will find out more about E-Granary. The teachers would tell us that, in fact, in many parts of Africa, they are the E-Granary. In other words, all the information that students have is limited and constrained and also made possible by the kind of information that teachers have, because there are very few books, very few materials in libraries, and so the teacher has all the information that students can have access to. The teacher is E-Granary. But what we see here is two of the teachers that we have worked with here, Josephine Wanyenya and Andrew Napakoli. And what we see here is there we have the E-Granary, which is the hard drive, and here we have it linked to the computer, and they are experimenting with using E-Granary. This is a picture I showed a little earlier, and what we see here is the excitement of these young students. as they engage with this technology. And most of the people pushing forward are young men. The young women are equally excited, but they do tend to stay a little bit more in the background. Here you see that I am working with 2 teachers, and although I am not myself an educational technologist, when I go to Uganda, my identity tends to shift to that of an educational technologist because we are all learning. I'm learning, and I'm certainly teaching my colleagues as well. And very often when there's a breakdown in communication, the eyes turn on me, and I've got to think fast. So it's troubleshooting has become a part of what I do in this context. You'll see in the background there's a blackboard, and you'll see some of the pictures that I drew to try and explain the system. You might wonder, how is it that you can run E-Granary when there's little electricity? And so what we see here is these solar panels, and these have proved very effective in places where there is no electricity. So even though solar panels are don't always work, but they are, they certainly can be very effective in many parts of rural Africa. What we see here, of course, is young students helping other students in remarkable ways, and 2 young men very excited about Wikipedia. So, when we first taught students about Wikipedia, we said, what are the things that would they like to learn? And they said they want to know about computers, they want to know our school start date, they want to know when they can borrow a dictionary. But as they developed insight into E-Granary and Wikipedia, their questions would shift towards more public forms of knowledge. What African country was first to get independence, and in what year? How many years did Nelson Mandela spend in prison, and what had he done to be imprisoned? Or how many terms are given to the President of America before electing another one? And how did Obama get to be in America since he is a black person? Very interesting questions. So in terms of I'm just going to give you just a hint at some of our findings here in terms of how the technological changes of our times influenced language and literacy learning in poorly resourced communities. And clearly what technology does is make the familiar strange. As we see here with young women, when they take photographs of a police commissioner, they can actually look at what is familiar, but they can also reframe what they understand by their relationship to the police commissioner. They can look at images of themselves as young women in different contexts. It also makes the strange familiar. For example, the clay keyboard, although the computer might be strange, they can become familiar through the clay keyboard. Or even the internet in a box can make the computer more accessible when computers and the internet become live in African communities. One of the students, Suena, says, I think it is important for the teachers to use E-Granary teaching us, because if they use E-Granary in the class and teach us, the students can come on the screen of the computer and see exactly what is the teacher is trying to teach and understand. So what we see here is that it's not just the teacher is E-Granary, then now there is a wider source of information, and both teachers and students can work together to access information and knowledge. In terms of the second question, how are identities and investment re-inscribed in new digital practices at local level? And what are the implications for practice? Listen to what the students had to say. Joseph, for example, said, I think it is important for me because first of all, I will be known as I have some knowledge of using the E-Granary. Some people will be who will come from very far will tell each other there is a gentleman. I'm a gentleman, Joseph, right? He knows the E-Granary, who can help you, who can guide you. So what we find is that Joseph's identity shifts from being a student to being a person who is knowledgeable about technology, a gentleman who can help others. And so his imagined identity shifts. We see Sarah saying, I want to spread technology about over the village, and then, if time goes on, even the world in general. Because there are many of our people in our villages that don't know about using the computer, and they cannot read. But if I train them how to use the computer, they never know they can use it. So what we see is how people are sharing what knowledge they have gained. What the future possibilities are in terms of people's jobs are also important in terms of their imagined identities. I may use that knowledge that I acquired from the E-Granary to get jobs like secretariat and also some simple jobs like playing discos, playing music on discos, and also other jobs in the category of computers. So I'm gaining future knowledge on the E-Granary. I don't want to romanticize the possibilities here, because it is also clear that there are still limited resources. As one of the students says, we have only one E-Granary and one computer. We could find problems, like often students could come and in the absence of Madam Carey, some students would disturb us saying that the computer is not ours. That has been the problem. So when you only have one computer, one E-Granary, and hundreds of people wishing to learn, clearly there are limitations in the technology. I'm going to conclude with 3 or 4 slides here, and I'm going to quote Maxine Prinsloo, a friend and colleague at the University of Cape Town, who says that many studies of the new literacies write about them from largely a middle class, usually American, European, Australian, or Asian context in mind. But that context is assumed rather than explicit. And so what we've tried to do in our research is to show what might be possible when one thinks about the digital in the African context. What are the imagined identities and imagined communities that might be possible for learners? What are their investments in the digital? And how might their identity shift as they become digitally literate? So I'm going to return to that very first image that we had of people working together to teach one another. So you see here a young man, perhaps not such a young man, who understands that he's bilingual in English and the local language. This picture was taken in northwestern Uganda, and it's an English newspaper. And people are working together to share what can be learned from that one English newspaper. So you meet someone who is literate, who knows English and also the local language to maximize learning. And I'm going to contrast that image with a more recent image of my wonderful and most beloved friend, Juliet Tembe, who is teaching a group of fellow teachers in the Ugandan context. Many of these teachers have never touched a computer before, never mind used a computer before. And yet what we see here is a huge investment in learning. And you see how Juliet Dr. Tembe is training other people in her community and making a huge difference in the African context. And you will see also here that she's teaching people about E-Granary. You'll see the image of the E-Granary, and both women and men learning in this context. And I'm going to end on with a comment that students have made about working with us on these projects. It was a conversation that Shelley Jones had with a student by the name of Vizita. And Shelley asked, how is learning English through doing a project like this different from learning English in the classroom? Vizita said, in class, teachers write on the blackboard and we just listen. in a research project, how do you use English? Communication. Do you learn more by studying English or by communicating in English? Communicating. Why? Because when you communicate, you think your own English. So what we see here is an ownership of meaning that these young people, as they engage with digital technology, how we see that their identities are shifting, how they're gaining ownership of meaning in their communities, and how they are developing multilingual literacy, developing literacy, of course, in the mother tongue, but also in English, and so that they have greater possibilities for the future. So I think I'm going to end on that note, and I'm going to invite questions from the audience, and thank you to everybody for joining me today. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar names, on the list of participants. And I think what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to shift back to the image of Juliet, which I think is inspiring. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over back to the organizers for questions. And if there aren't that many questions, like a good teacher, I have some backup slides that I can share with you. But I'm going to, I think I'm handing over to Dennis, who I think is going to navigate the questions. So I'm unmuting. Thank you to you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Norton. This is Dennis Murphy-Odo, Assistant Professor of Language and Literacy Education at Georgia State University. First, I'd like to sincerely thank you for the insightful discussion and sharing your magnificent images with us. I'm sure we can all agree that those pictures spoke more than 1,000 words. Dr. Norton, this is where I'll take a few minutes to share some questions that our participants asked in the chat box while you were presenting. Thanks to all for the thought-provoking questions, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time permitting. So my first question is fairly straightforward, and it deals with the idea of fostering investment. It comes from Sherry Lee, and she asks, how do we create classroom conditions for students to have an investment orientation? And is this possible? So if you'd like to comment on that, Dr. Norton.
Bonnie, you'll need to turn your mic back on again.
Thank you. Yes, Peggy, I was just about to do that. And thank you very much for the question, Sherry. For me, the issue is around creating investment in the classroom is it depends a great deal on what context you are working in. If you have 30 students in a class, if you have 120 students in a class, your strategies are going to be different. One of the things that I have done in my classrooms is to work with students' journals. And what I've asked them to do is to enter into the wider society as ethnographers of their societies, so that they go into their communities, and rather than as being students, they are engaging with their societies as ethnographers. Then they would take notes on their experiences in their communities and then bring those comments back into the classroom. And when they bring their comments back into the classroom, I learn not only about the students, but I learn about the communities in which they live. What they also learn is, what students learn from one another is that the experiences that they have had are not unique to themselves. And they can learn from one another that how do people navigate the communities in which they live. So what I try to do, Sherry, is to develop in my classroom a sense of community. That students, so I'm trying to shift from students thinking that that it's only their imagined communities that are important to them. Certainly their imagined communities are important, but for me what is equally important is how can I make the classroom a vibrant space? How can I develop the relationships between students in the classroom amongst one another? So I need to learn more about the students. They also need to learn more about one another. So by them becoming ethnographers of their societies, they share those insights with me, but they share it with their other students as well, so that they see that they relate to one another in different ways. So that's one point. Another point another strategy that I use is that if there are learners in the class who may be silent or perhaps are not participating that well, I try to see where their particular strengths might lie. Perhaps they might be a wonderful musician, or perhaps they might be a great soccer player, or they might be a great artist. And then I try to structure classroom activities where those particular talents will come to the fore. So that a student, for example, who may not be maybe very quiet might come into a classroom and play the violin for us, or the drums one day. And suddenly the student's identity shifts from being a very quiet student to being a violinist or being a drummer. And as that student's identity shifts, other students relate to that student in a different way. So what I try to use is try to develop the multiple identities that learners have, so that they can speak from positions of strength rather than from positions of weakness. So those are the two strategies, one being the ethnographer in their community, but also shifting the identity that that learner has within the classroom itself. Thank you. Okay, Dennis.
Great. That's great, Dr. Norton. If I can, I have a follow-up question. And so my follow-up question has to do, I think the main theme is to do with the threat of westernization. And this comes from PromDM is the username. So in the beginning of he says, in the beginning, he or she says, in the beginning of the presentation, there was a quote from one of the parents involved in the research being shown. She made a valid point about not adopting other cultures, but improving on your own culture. Do you find that the introduction of technology also causes other cultures to westernize in some ways? And if so, is this an impact that is foreseen by the people that you interacted with to gather your research? Oh, your mic's not on.
Thanks, Dennis, for reminding me. Thank you for that very important question. First of all, I think it's very important to note that we do that people, in the African context, are certainly interested in learning from more, perhaps from countries where there are many resources. People do want to have access to those resources, but at the same time, people want to contribute. We find that Ugandans also want to contribute to that international community, so that we are equal partners in this digital world, so that the flow of information is not just one way, from the north to the south, but also from the south to the north. So the issue is that if we are seen to be living in a global community where we gain information, but we also contribute to information, then I think that that's a much healthier and much more egalitarian relationship. This is precisely why in my research I've been very interested in the digital, because I do think that is one way in which African communities can contribute to the international community. As people develop expertise in the digital, people are not only receivers of the digital, but also producers of the digital, and can also enter into the digital world from a position of strength. So I think that if one works together collaboratively, what we see is a much more productive relationship, where the West learns from the East, where the North learns from the South, and the South learns from the North, and the East learns from the West, which is, I think, a very exciting scenario. So over to you for any other questions, Dennis.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I might have time for one more question, and this one comes from Cindy Fujimoto. This generated a little bit of discussion in the chat area, so I thought I'd hand it off to you. She says, I'm wondering about the government's take on the spread of literacy and growing knowledge among the poor and marginalized. She's thinking about Freire, and how much is this welcomed by particular governments?
Okay, that's another excellent question. And of course, in answer to this, it depends a great deal on what government one has. And of course, governments do continually change. Certainly in the Ugandan context, the government is very interested in issues of literacy, and certainly in spirit, the government is supporting the development of digital literacy in the community, in both rural and urban communities. What the government doesn't have, though, is a great deal of resources, and that's really the huge challenge. So the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, in a sense. And I think this is true for many African communities. At the same time, I do appreciate that in some communities in the world, the spread of literacy might be seen perhaps as a threat by some governments. But at the same time, what we see in popular movements is that people certainly do want to draw on the digital in order to democratize practices in their own communities. And we see, for example, the role of the digital in the Arab Spring and how important the digital was in that context. So I think, as I say, it depends a great deal on the government and its relationship to the people. Thank you.
That's great. I think that is pretty much time for the questions that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to the moderators, and again say thank you very much for the excellent questions to our participants and for the well-considered answers to Dr. Norton.